Mary I of England, better known by the grim sobriquet Bloody Mary, was born in February 1516 to King Henry VIII and his first queen, Catherine of Aragon, and from her earliest days her life was enmeshed with the turbulence of dynastic politics, the anxieties of succession, and the deep religious fault lines that would tear England apart. And as the only surviving child of Henry and Catherine, she was initially cherished as the legitimate heir to the throne, showered with princely honors. Trained in languages, music, and courtly skills, yet always shadowed by her father's obsessive longing for a male heir, and when no son came, Henry's determination to annul his marriage to Catherine cast Mary into a storm that would scar her for life. Because when Henry broke from Rome to declare himself head of the Church of England, Mary's legitimacy was annulled, her title stripped, and her beloved mother set aside to die in lonely exile. And Mary herself, once the jewel of the court, was reduced to a bastardized figure forced into humiliating service in the household of her half-sister Elizabeth, a degradation she never forgot. And through these trials she clung with unyielding devotion to the Catholic faith of her mother, finding in the rituals of the Church and the authority of the Pope not just religion but identity and justice. And this unwavering loyalty would later define the trajectory of her reign, for while Henry's England drifted into schism and Edward VI's regime entrenched Protestant reforms, Mary held to the Mass, to the Virgin, to the Pope, believing that the soul of England itself depended upon restoration to the old faith. And so as Edward sickened and died, the Protestant elite led by the Duke of Northumberland sought to bar Mary from succession, engineering the brief usurpation of Lady Jane Grey. But in a display of resolve that astonished even her allies, Mary rode out boldly, rallied thousands to her banner, and within days swept into London in triumph, cheered by crowds who saw her not as a butcher, but as the rightful heir of Henry VIII and the symbol of legitimate monarchy. And on July 1553 she was crowned queen, and for a brief, shimmering moment the people hoped her reign would bring stability and reconciliation. But Mary's mind was fixed not on compromise but on restoration, and her heart beat with a singular mission: to return England to the bosom of Rome, to purge the heresies that had taken root, to wash away with fire and law the Protestant innovations of the past 2 decades. For she believed with absolute conviction that her task was divine, ordained by God, and to falter would be to betray not just her mother's memory, but the eternal salvation of her realm. And so with the vigor of newfound power she repealed Edwardian reforms, restored Catholic bishops, reinstated papal authority, and summoned her cousin Cardinal Reginald Pole to guide England back to Rome. And though at first many welcomed the return of ancient ritual and ceremony, suspicions soon grew, for Mary's restoration was not tempered with tolerance but enforced with heresy trials, imprisonments, and burnings. And when men like Thomas Cranmer, Hugh Latimer, and Nicholas Ridley refused to recant their faith, they were condemned and burned alive, their screams and prayers rising from the pyres of Oxford and Smithfield to echo across Europe. And the people who had once hailed Mary began to whisper in dread, calling her cruel, calling her Bloody Mary, as hundreds of Protestants met their deaths in flames. Yet from Mary's perspective these executions were acts of salvation, purging heresy from souls and cleansing England's conscience. For to her the fires were not instruments of cruelty, but of purification, though to history they would remain her eternal mark of infamy. And at the same time Mary bound her fortunes to Spain through marriage to Philip II, a union she believed would strengthen Catholicism and secure an heir. But the match proved deeply unpopular, stoking rebellion such as Wyatt's uprising, which Mary crushed with stern resolve, showing no mercy even to her half-sister Elizabeth, whom she imprisoned in the Tower under suspicion of complicity. And though Elizabeth survived, the distrust and rivalry between the two sisters deepened, foreshadowing the stark reversal that would follow Mary's death. And meanwhile the Queen, growing older and increasingly desperate for a child, endured false pregnancies that shattered her health and eroded her credibility, while her Spanish husband grew distant, leaving her isolated, clinging more fiercely than ever to her faith. And in those final years the burnings continued. The economy faltered, foreign wars drained resources, and the people's love turned to resentment. So that when Mary died in 1558, abandoned by fortune, Her dream of a Catholic England lay in ruins, and Elizabeth ascended to undo her work, yet the memory of her reign, though brief, left a scar so deep that her name became synonymous with blood, persecution, and fanaticism. And though modern historians have sought to temper the image, to see in her the wounded child of Catherine of Aragon, the devout soul striving for salvation, the queen caught in the cruel web of Tudor politics, the legend of Bloody Mary endures, forged in the fires she lit, immortalized in the screams of martyrs, etched forever as a warning of what happens when conviction turns to cruelty. And so part one of her tale closes not in flames, but in the moment of her rise, her triumphal seizure of the throne, her vision of restoration still untainted by the horrors to come. For here we see Mary as the daughter who defied betrayal, the woman who rallied a nation, the queen who believed utterly that she was God's chosen. And in that unwavering faith we glimpse both the greatness of her resolve and the shadow of the tragedy that would soon consume her reign. Mary I of England, whose reign began with hope but descended swiftly into fear and fire, entered the second half of her brief rule utterly convinced that she was carrying out God's will, and it was in this conviction that the darkest chapters of her legacy unfolded. For having re-established papal authority, repealed Protestant reforms, and restored Catholic ritual, she now sought to root out heresy wherever it appeared, and so began the Marian persecutions, a campaign that would see nearly 300 men and women executed by burning, their deaths staged as both punishment and spectacle, meant to terrify the populace into submission and to demonstrate the Queen's unwavering resolve to cleanse her realm of Protestant blasphemy. And among the earliest and most symbolic victims was John Rogers, the translator of the English Bible, who was burned in 1555 before a vast crowd. His courage in the flames inspiring whispers of defiance even as the smoke rose over Smithfield, and soon after came the executions of Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley, once bishops of the Reformed Church, who were chained back to back and set alight in Oxford, with Latimer famously encouraging his companion to be steadfast, declaring that their deaths would light a candle that would never be put out. And indeed their martyrdom kindled Protestant resolve, spreading tales of courage that outlasted Mary's flames. While Thomas Cranmer, the former Archbishop of Canterbury and the very architect of Henry's break with Rome, was also condemned, and though he faltered by signing recantations, at the final moment he thrust his hand into the fire, the hand that had betrayed his conscience, crying that it would burn first, and thus perished in agony, sealing his defiance with the flames. And as these burnings multiplied, carried out not only in London but across provincial towns from Canterbury to Gloucester, men and women of humble birth as well as scholars and preachers suffered, their deaths recorded in vivid detail by John Foxe in his Book of Martyrs, a work that would immortalize their sacrifice and stain Mary's name forever. For to Protestants, she became not the savior of souls, but a tyrant drenched in blood, and even among her Catholic subjects unease grew, for the fires seemed unending and the Queen's zeal untempered. And while the pyres burned, Mary's political fortunes also soured, for her marriage to Philip of Spain, though intended to strengthen her Catholic cause, instead deepened her unpopularity, for the people feared foreign domination, resented Spanish influence at court, and bristled at the prospect of England being drawn into Spain's continental wars. And indeed, when Philip persuaded Mary to support his campaigns against France, the result was the disastrous loss of Calais in 1558, England's last possession on the continent, a humiliation that struck at national pride and compounded the Queen's misery, for she had staked much of her reputation on the alliance with Spain, yet Philip himself cared little for her, spending most of his time abroad, leaving Mary lonely, embittered, and increasingly desperate for an heir. And her phantom pregnancies, in which she convinced herself she was with child only to be cruelly disappointed, became both a personal torment and a public scandal, eroding her credibility and fueling the sense that her reign was cursed, while the fires of persecution continued to rage, alienating more and more of her subjects, who had once cheered her return but now saw in her only a queen who brought death, division, and despair. And in this atmosphere of disillusion her health began to fail, worn down by grief, loneliness, and the burden of a mission that seemed forever out of reach. And when she died in November 1558 at the age of 42, She left behind a realm weary of her rule, relieved almost to see it end, and her half-sister Elizabeth ascended the throne, swiftly reversing her policies and restoring Protestantism, thereby ensuring that Mary's dream of a Catholic England would perish with her. And yet her legacy lived on, not as the devoted daughter of Catherine of Aragon, not as the courageous woman who defied Northumberland and seized her throne, but as Bloody Mary, the queen who lit hundreds of pyres, whose unyielding faith turned to cruelty, and whose reign became a byword for fanaticism. And in the centuries that followed, Protestant historians like John Fox cemented this image, presenting her as a monster of tyranny, while even sympathetic voices struggled to redeem her reputation. For though it is true that she was shaped by trauma, that she acted from sincere conviction, that she sought to save souls rather than damn them, the inescapable fact remains that her policies bathed England in blood, and no matter how one weighs her motives, the fires she lit defined her reign, so that when people across the world hear the name Bloody Mary, they recall not the girl who suffered her father's rejection, not the queen who rode to power in triumph, but the monarch who sent her subjects to the stake. And so her story endures as both tragedy and warning, a reminder of how power fused with religious certainty can unleash terror, and how history, once it brands a name in blood, rarely forgives or forgets. And thus in this second part of her tale, we see the full descent from the promise of legitimacy to the legacy of persecution, from the cheers that greeted her coronation to the curses that followed her death. And in that arc lies the essence of Mary's reign. Brief, turbulent, consumed by faith, and forever haunted by the flame she believed would save her kingdom, but which instead condemned her name to eternal infamy.